just the head. That was the third reason why I didn't even know I was in an abusive marriage for 20 years, is I was completely disconnected from my body and my emotions, and it was just the head that was functioning. So I had a unique combination where I had a husband at the time that was Asperger-ish, and I didn't even know that actually until we were separated. And then myself, as a kind girl, I was overly focused on the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of others and outwardly focused all the time. Another term for that is also called high-functioning codependency, and I was a pro. So between those two interacting things where I had a husband at the time who was completely disconnected as well and didn't believe in intuition and feelings or anything, and then every time I would bring up anything to talk about, any conflict, I would be shut down. And when I mean shut down, I would be ignored. So I'd be ignored for 6 days, not touched, not really talked to, just have to say the bare minimum. If I bring it up again, ignored another 6 days. And that was the pattern that was super destructive to my body. Because for me, as a highly relational person, that was incredibly stressful and I felt very isolated. I felt like I was in the high security prison where I was being isolated all the time emotionally from my partner. And for me, marriage was about being married to your best friend and having a connection, and there was not a connection. Very stressful on my body. But rather than listening to my emotions and my body, I didn't. I used to say things like, just forgive and love, things like that. But what happens is, let's talk about emotions. Emotions are vibrations, feelings in our body, and they either get talked about or they get acted out or they do some damage. They don't just go away. So it's really important to understand that. And so what I was doing was suppressing all of those emotions and ignoring them, and it had a huge result on my body. For me, I had a weakened immune system, autoimmune challenges, hormone imbalances, ear infections, just one thing after the other. But rather than listening to my body and saying, hey, body, what are you telling me? I chose to ignore it and tell my body what to do, and that we were on this route and we're going for the end, and that's all that mattered. So it's interesting that we have this disconnection here in America. And that's a lot of us, all we know, but that's actually really different than a lot of places. For example, Western medicine is very, you got your body, your mind, and your spirit, and then let's treat them all, differently. And the spirit, is just for the spiritual people and for the church, and your body and your mind are, we just treat the body, but they're very immersed and very connected. Eastern medicine and naturopathic medicine understands that a lot more, and they're looking for the root causes. And even in the Bible talks about heart, soul, mind, and spirit. But actually in that whole society, they believe that all that was one. And there wasn't that distinction that we try to work with today, or we assume that we have today. So let's talk about body wisdom. What is that? It's basically listening to our body and what it's telling us. And then also, getting emotionally connected with ourselves. That's listening to our emotions and what they're telling us. And those are all very connected with our physical systems, our spiritual parts of us. Like all of that is so interwoven. So how do you get connected to your body? Really, you can do something as easy as like pausing several times a day and just asking your body, or finding out what stresses it's feeling or how it's feeling, and really getting connected with your body. I just ignored my body. And then now, even with medicine, we're finding this gut-brain connection, because there's so much connection between what our body is doing, and stress really impacts our gut and just the microbiome, the microbes there, the healthy ones and the unhealthy ones. And that really affects our brains. For me, that had a really dramatic impact, because during the most stressful time in my marriage, which was like, it was all stressful, but there were 2 bouts that were extra stressful after about a 5-year of more severe emotional abuse. And at that time, the first time it happened, I not only had a baby, had an undiagnosed Hashimoto's, but I took an antibiotic and messed up my gut health, and I felt a huge difference with just my brain working and how it was functioning. So very much affects everything. So for me, I was being emotionally challenged in my marriage. And like I said, 5 years into it, I had a baby and then had the undiagnosed Hashimoto's and the other things going on. So with my story, 5 years into a marriage, which was very challenging emotionally with the passive aggressive and the stonewalling and things like that, and just feeling all these emotions, but having to suppress them. What happened is then I had a baby, so I was at a weakened immune time. Then I had undiagnosed Hashimoto's that actually wouldn't get diagnosed for another 8 years, but I could tell because I have a pre-med background and know my body enough, but not quite enough. So my hair is falling out, I'm eating everything in sight, and I'm losing weight. Then I have the antibiotic, which messed up my gut health. And before I know it, I'm trying to get away from the marriage because I can't, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And I end up in the psych ward with a bipolar diagnosis. It's time to change the way you see yourself from God's perspective. Click the link below to get free affirmations and printable affirmations to support you in your Live Brighter journey. The weird thing is just how my body was reacting to all of this stress. So it had gotten so bad where I couldn't even keep myself warm anymore. And my legs stopped working where it was hard to walk. And it was very, very challenging how my body was responding to all this stress. So I first got awakened to how big this connection is, especially with mental illness and the impact of that, I would call it mental challenges, is with the book Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk MD. And he's a psychiatrist, and he really got into just how our body responds to stress and emotional stress and psychological and abuse and how that impacts our mind. He made a very interesting connection in the book about how even the medication I was on for bipolar was fabulous for keeping yourself in abusive marriages because it was like so dumbing down like your emotions and experience and kind of putting you in a survival mode in and of itself that you really couldn't deal with a whole lot other than that. And that was definitely my experience. Another book that's very interesting is Mind Body Prescription, and that's by a Dr. MD, John E. Sarno. This was interesting for me later on. This was after my divorce and just getting my whole brain and body and everything healthy. Is that I had this chronic pain in my right shoulder and my right neck at the base of my skull, and it was just a chronic pain. And anyways, you know how you open yourself up to, hey, I need to learn what's going on. Lord, help me. And he'll bring the right tools to you. So this book somehow, I don't even know how, got brought into my life and I read it. The funny thing was I was on my honeymoon with Michael and I'm just listening to that, here and there. And he made something that a very big impact as far as he talks about tension Myocyto Syndrome, which basically is suppressed unconscious, strong emotions, a lot of time rage, and how that can impact the body and cause blood constriction in areas where your body's like, feel this pain. So it will distract you from dealing with and feeling these strong emotions. Well, for me, I was terrified of rage because, I experienced it one time, and that was before I went into the psych ward the first time, which was, 5 years into the marriage. I was just so rageful at how I could be treated this way and have this experience. And then I had this horrible, experience following that. So I looked at rage as something really bad. And I think also biblically, I got this idea that rage is bad. And so I really had suppressed that particular emotion. And so it was interesting as I was going through the process of what they tell you in the book and just allowed myself to have that rage for the things that I had felt were injustices and stuff like that and really bring that into the conscious. And that didn't mean I was throwing dishes and yelling and screaming, but I was just allowing myself to experience and allowing it. And the amazing thing is since then, I have not had pain in that right neck and right shoulder at all. So I just used this technique. And again, it was just reiterating that deep connection we have between our emotions, our mind, and our bodies, and how really learning to work with that is really powerful and amazing. Another book that is really interesting is Brain Energy, and that's by Christopher M. Palmer, MD, another psychiatrist. And he talks a lot about how basically our bodies just being in a stressful state of metabolic challenges, how that causes so many things, mental challenges. And he had a really interesting connection between diet and a mental illness. And he talks about a patient that was schizophrenic and had been for a long time, and just how changing his diet and what he was doing, actually his symptoms went away, which, according to classic psychiatry, that doesn't happen. And so that's a very interesting thing to look into, and talking about how our whole bodies, what our bodies are doing so much affect our brains and what they're doing and how they're responding. He made another comment that I thought was really interesting about like Ukraine. We have the war in Ukraine, and how those people, if you use the diagnostic tools of a psychiatrist, they would all be diagnosed with a mental illness right now, because according to and I can't even remember the name of the book that they use, but like if you have depression over 3 weeks, then you would be classified as having like depression, quote unquote, being diagnosed with it. But it doesn't take into account, like, let's say a husband lost his wife and she passed away and he's depressed about it. If he's depressed for 3 weeks, it doesn't matter the situation, because it's he's got depression. So I think psychiatrists and Western medicine is kind of waking up to the idea of circumstances really do matter, and we're a whole person. And so just trying to kind of cut off our body and emotions and kind of just diagnose based on symptoms and not the whole person isn't very effective. The cool thing is our responsibility. So Jesus says, and God says, that we are supposed to love others as we love ourselves. And so to love ourselves, that means we are the first ones responsible to take care of our physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, all of our well-being. That is our job and our responsibility. And that doesn't get delegated to anybody else. And that's really powerful. So just getting in touch with your physical and your feelings and all of that is super important. Another thing I had a hard time was being in touch with my feelings. So the feeling wheel or the emotion wheel is super helpful. And that is like when you're experiencing a feeling and you don't have a word for it, having this feeling wheel, which basically divides up words, anger, like in the center of the wheel, you've got anger, sadness, and as you go out, it gets more specific. And being able to identify feelings and emotions at a deeper level, and then being able to connect why are we feeling that, is really important for our well-being, super important. So loving yourself is listening to your body, listening to your emotions, being honest with yourself. And another way to do this is through what I've talked about in the BARF notebook. And that's, again, the 3-step process of barf it out, sort it out, and plan it out. And just taking that time to really do that inner work. My thoughts are just stretch yourself, grow yourself, know yourself 1% a day. Deepen yourself. And you will be amazed at what you can do in a year. It's amazing. So I'm super excited. I believe in you. Let your light shine brighter.